would be.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to special needs trusts.
Special needs trust. Why don't you tell me about what a special need trust is?
Okay, so, you know, these are kind of a tragic situation. And actually what a special needs trust is a derivative of a spendthrift trust. In other words, your creditors can't attack the trust.
Well, it's like an irrevocable trust.
Well, even more so, like a spendthrift trust is where let's say you have a kid who just like spends all his money and wastes his money.
That's spendthrift trust.
You would say, well, he's a spendthrift, and I've got some trust here that'll pay for his housing and his food and maybe his schooling.
But it's all limited on, it's like an allowance.
But he can't, but if he goes and wastes money in Vegas, those creditors can't come and attack that trust.
Well, that's because the trust is because it is limited on its distribution. You can't take extra money principal out of the trust.
Right.
And so what happens is on a spendthrift, the spendthrift is an interesting device because what it does is to make it so the beneficiary can't do anything with that money.
Can't do anything stupid, basically.
Stupid. They can't go waste it all on a party and they go. You say Vegas, they could go gamble a couple of $1 million away on a weekend, and then they'd be left to the side of the road as a homeless person. But this is different than that. This is a little more than that, Mark.
But it's a derivative of it, and what it is because what happens, and a lot of these start as a tragedy. Let's say you have a, you know, one case I'm familiar with, you know, someone had been drinking too much, and they ran a red light and they T-boned another vehicle. Right?
T-bone!
And, you know, that person was paralyzed.
And the person that they T-boned was paralyzed.
Yeah, and so you get some money from the insurance company. Now, what a lot of people don't understand, and I think is a note that people should understand, is like, you should get a little more coverage on your insurance than you have. I mean, people always say, I want the minimum insurance.
Yeah, $15.30.
But for a couple bucks more, you can get some more coverage, and it's actually a good idea.
Well, actually, Mark,
it's a good idea to have a little more coverage.
The reason why coverage is good at a higher level is because of a couple of things. One,
even for yourself.
Yeah, even for yourself.
What if the guy,
a serious accident,
and what if the guy's not covered?
Have a lot of trouble with exactly how that pays off. And in fact, what happens is that if you injure somebody dramatically, they can keep a judgment against you for effectively as long as they renew it for life.
Every 10 years.
Every 10 years they have to renew it. But they could have it. They could have it going for life. Effectively.
And also, maybe someone who hits you is not insured.
That's
so you have to rely on your own insurance.
Then that way you better have uninsured motorists.
Yeah, so I mean, people go, well, I hate paying for insurance, but it's not really bad to throw a little more money into your car insurance because these things do happen. But let's say the worst happens and someone hits somebody else, and even if the insurance, usually a policy limits like 100 grand or 300 grand, and so, you know, that person would get that settlement, right?
Right.
But now that they are going to have all these huge medical expenses, their family can't afford that. Their insurance is not going to cover that.
Right.
They're going to end up going to Medicare, which in California becomes Medi-Cal.
Right. And unfortunately, in California, with the Medi-Cal.
No, excuse me, it's Medicaid becomes Medi-Cal.
Medi-Cal. Yeah,
Medicare is a
Medicare
kind of an earned,
is for senior citizens.
It's an earned, distribution.
It's when you get to a certain point and you elect to take it. But the thing about Medi-Cal is very simple. They can seek reimbursement for all monies they pay.
Right.
And so the trust you're talking about actually adds a protection so that if you have assets, you can protect your assets without the state coming back like a vampire and effectively wiping any assets you have out after your death. And the problem with that is the state it's a ruthless act by the state. But they're saying, well, if we gave you care, we deserve to be reimbursed. The problem with that whole theory is that reimbursement that was taxpayer money that went to care for that person. It wasn't the state's money. So when the state comes back to try and say we need to be reimbursed, so what? Why do you need to be reimbursed? And when in fact those are taxes that were paid into it.
Well, yeah, that's one argument, but you know, they're going to come back and they're going to, you know, in a typical case, if you run up a bill and it's covered under public assistance, and that's whether it's SSI or it's Medi-Cal,
right,
they're going to seek a reimbursement, you know, against that estate. But if you have, like, say, if you had a settlement from the car insurance, just for example, or any other kind of personal injury, you could take that settlement and put it in a special needs trust, right?
Right.
Or whatever income you could find. It's up to the judge because everything you do in a special needs trust, there's accounting every year, and I think and after that, every 2 years.
Well, you're gonna have to have a trustee that runs a trust anyway.
But you're gonna have to get the judge's approval on your accounting.
Well, that's because under a lot of the cases we've had recently, and specifically in Santa Clara County, where there's been these trusts that were actually set up and being milked by the trustees. They were court-appointed trustees. And in fact, you could have somebody that had maybe have been awarded $500,000, have their entire $500,000 go to a trustee who is administering the trust on their behalf, allegedly.
Well, the thing is, the trustee can bill for their time. You know.
Well, yeah, but here's the problem. What they found in Santa Clara County specifically, and it was kind of not a whistleblower, but what they found was a lot of the court-appointed trustees who did this for a living were actually milking the trust for substantially more than they deserved.
Okay, well,
and they had attorney fees bills that were half the value of the trust.
But milking is a nasty word. But what happens is
milking.
But if you can,
if you milk a cat, that might be a nasty word.
But the thing about it is that a lot of times you have a guardian ad litem who's like a member of the family. That could be the trustee. And anytime you get a professional trustee or a professional receiver, they're going to charge quite a bit of money.
Well, you could be charged $500 an hour by somebody.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, you can charge more than that.
Yeah, well, there's the problem. Pretty soon your trust is gone at $500 an hour. That's like every 1,000's only 2 hours.
No, so
and if it takes 20, 30 hours a year,
so if you have
that starts adding up.
If you have a trusted member of the family, that's usually a good way to go if you can do it. But so what happens?
But you know what? Who is trusted?
Okay, well, that's the thing. It's got to be.
You give it to a bank to let them administer the trust?
I'm just saying, a lot of times it's a sister or a brother or a mother or a cousin, whatever.
And they're the ones driving the Ferrari out of your trust.
Yeah, but the thing about it is, well, they have to be approved by the judge.
Every year
they
have to be approved.
They have to do all that accounting has to be approved.
That Testarossa has to be approved.
That has to be approved. And so, and also what they're looking at is that what in the special needs trust is reasonable. And so things that public assistance wouldn't pay for, Medi-Cal wouldn't pay for it.
Right.
Let's say you want a motorized wheelchair. Let's say you have to expand the doorways so you can put a wheelchair through or something and get around the corner.
ADA requirement.
All these kind of things. Those, or let's say you want some videos or a special kind of, whatever the person wants in that, in their disabled state that Medi-Cal won't cover, right? And you got to be careful because you don't want to buy things that Medi-Cal would cover and then they'll say, wait a minute, you got to conflict.
The whole thing is the Medi-Cal, they have a gatekeeper.
But it's reasonably bare bones. Yeah. Reasonably bare bones.
Of course.
And so the special needs trust would help the person with a disability on their special needs, and then Medi-Cal couldn't attack that. But the best thing about it, especially if you have a family member that goes to be the trustee and is doing this, and like I said, they can get reimbursed for their time. They do get, a fee. They can't get attacked later, and the state can't come after the trustee and say, wait a minute, we spent $2 million carrying on this, on the Benny here, on the beneficiary, and now we want this out of the trustee. So the special needs trust protects the trustee.
Well, okay, so the bottom line of a special needs trust is to protect the assets of the beneficiary of the trust, to ensure that if there's anything that they need in the future, that they'll actually have the ability to use it without worrying about anything they've collected from the government being sucked back into the government.
Right.
And so that's kind of a bottom line. But most of these are set up in cases where there's been a severe injury.
Oh yeah, it's usually pretty tragic.
Yeah, it's a tragic story, and what's even more tragic.
You could have a situation also where someone is injured and then they couldn't work, and that'd be their disability. They could be mental deficiencies. You could have Alzheimer's. There's lots of other disabilities.
Yeah, that's really sad.
I mean, there's paralysis. There's Alzheimer's. There's a lot of places where you can get a disability where this would be applicable.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is you're hoping that you should always talk to a good attorney or have your family members talk to an attorney if you can to decide what actually operates the best in your favor. And the thing about this is this is something that's very special, so you want to make sure you have a specialist that sets this up. You don't want to have Joe Bob, the attorney down on the street corner that takes PI accidents, as the only guy that sets this up. You really need to see a specialist because these are complicated trusts. If they're not set up accurately and properly, they can be pierced. And that means that the state can come back and try to get all your money out of your trust, regardless of what you called it. And that's a problem about trust. Trust wording is critical. And every time you change any wording, you better make sure that the right person's changing it and that it's not just a random act of, I want to, change, I want to make somebody else the beneficiary. I mean,
yeah, well, you got to be, it has to be properly set up, and you have to be careful on how you spend the money. Because like I said, you've got to do an annual account.
Right.
And it can be for the right type of purposes. But one of the bigger things is they're a little complex to set up, and you got to start early, because if you get the money, let's say for instance you got in a car
Well, if you
accident,
start taking collection from the state before you have it set up.
or also, but what if you took a settlement before you set it up?
Oh, well,
then you would be, then you would,
subject to.
those liens would go against before you get it in. So
Okay.
basically, before you take the money for your settlement, or
Right.
before this influx of cash comes in,
Right.
you want to make sure the S&T has been approved by the, that's the
Good.
Special Needs Trust.
Right.
It's been approved by the judge is on board, and we're moving right along. And so
We are moving right along.
So we
aren't
don't have any.
Anyway, I think this is good for tonight, and I'll tell you, for tonight, I really appreciate you coming and watching us and enjoying a little lighthearted law talk tonight. We were hoping to make sure that we're all having a good time. And by the way, Mark, here's to you, my friend.
Have a cigar.
Have a cigar, Chicago style.
Okay. All right, have-